All right, the plight of actors in South Africa continues unabated. Actors across the industry, artists, of course, are reporting new or clauses rather being added to their contracts that are, and I quote, harmful to their livelihoods. You may have seen recent demonstrations in the United States where thousands of workers united against contractual demands, of course protesting, and now here the SA Guild of Actors wants government to address their concerns. And let's hear more now from Saga Chairman, that is of course Jack Dev Narain. Thank you so much for joining me, Mr. Dev Narain. I think, first and foremost, let's talk about, South African actors and how they're being denied their right to strike and engage, of course, when it comes to collective bargaining. And how does that impact their working conditions? I also spoke to actually my cousin who is a costume designer in the States, and they are obviously protesting now as well. So maybe also, talk about the comparison about, how they are being treated when it comes to this and, compared to us here in South Africa. Of course, there's a big difference that you will, of course, outline for us. But yeah, please elaborate on that.
The South African creative sector as a whole stands as an anomaly to the rest of the world, because whenever you look at a creative sector around the world, even in Africa, whether you look at Nigeria, Kenya, Morocco, Mauritius, you'll find that the creative sectors are regulated. They are regarded as industries. And one of the characteristics of being an industry is that there is fair regulation in place, and often it's in the form of collective bargaining. And when you look at the US now, as you referenced earlier, you've got 160,000 plus actors who are members of the biggest actors union in the world, the SAG-AFTRA. And they had decided that they were confronted with issues that were presented to them in a negotiation, a multi-party negotiated environment that included the streamers, the studios, directors, producers, and everybody else. And in that negotiation, they felt that there were issues that were unsurmountable and that needed to be addressed. And for them at that time, industrial action was the only way forward, which is why they went on strike. And it's part of the rights that they have available to them. In South Africa, though, creatives like myself and others are regarded as freelancers. And being a freelancer, it means I am not protected under the Labour Relations Act. And why is that act important? Well, that's the piece of labor law that actually allows us to form a union, to join a union, to engage in collective bargaining. So in that kind of scenario in South Africa, if you find yourself in a sector that is not being fairly regulated, then all the power, all the negotiating, all the commercial power sits on the side of the people who have all the money, which will be the broadcasters and
the producers.
The producers, absolutely.
Let's talk about that. It sounds like, especially, freelancers in this country, we always, see these problems when it comes to this industry or, the industry in general for creatives. Let's talk about, is it possibly then exploitation of actors, and the list goes on, at the end of the day? And what should then be done legislatively? What changes should then come into effect here?
We need to mobilize more support from within the sector so that more actors are aware of how they're being exploited. Many actors come through the system excited by the work, driven by passion, looking at the prospects ahead of them, especially if they're a young performer, and they forget to stop and ask the question, what is in my contract? Because given the fact that you don't have a union to represent you, given the fact that you barely have any statute to help structure regulation in your sector, all you're left with is a contract where you yourself as the performer were not allowed to give any input into that contract. So we need to get actors mobilized. We need to get the public mobilized behind the actors so that we can propel this movement to government to say the creative sector deserves to be regulated.
I think, it's one thing to get the actors and the creatives behind, this cause. But I think the production companies also need to play a significant role here, because I've heard, stories where, your seat's easily replaceable.
Yes.
You can easily be replaced, because somebody can come in cheaper at some point, So that is, I think, one major issue, especially when it comes to creatives and actors in this industry, because everybody wants their chance in the spotlight, and hopefully from there, you know, their first gig, they might get other gigs. Where then comes the responsibility, I think, to the production companies, where they need to play a role as well, to make sure that, you know, actors' rights are also being protected here, and that they're not the ones just making the money at the end of the day, because it seems like, you know, that's all production companies care about at the moment.
Production companies, broadcasters and streamers, they're really driven by profit. So when they draft an actor's contract, they guarantee that all the commercial rights are sitting on their side of the contract, and nothing is being handed over to the performer's side. And you're quite right, we need to make sure that production companies and broadcasters are also held accountable. But how do we do that in an unregulated sector such as ours? Which is why we need to establish some form of collective bargaining environment. And in fact, we won't be inventing anything new. Whichever sector you look around in this country, whether it's transport or agriculture or retail or banking, there is some form of regulation. And we very much favor what collective bargaining does as a mechanism for fair regulation. And that's something that we are arguing for. We want South Africa to align with international best practices, to say, let's introduce collective bargaining so that we can make sure that one person is not being passed up simply because they are wanting to negotiate their rights in a particular contract.
And I know there is a petition at the moment on the SAGA website, if I'm not mistaken, so how can every South African at the end of the day help in this cause?
We are asking, and this is important, Baron, because I'm not telling South African people to simply sign the petition. Of course I want them to, but more than that, I want them to read the specific clauses that have caused us to embark on this course of action. We want people to see the exact clauses that are written in real contracts that actors are being forced to sign. And that's where people will see the extent of the abuse, the extent of the exploitation, where people are literally putting in contract that if I have to sign my name to this, the producer has the right to take my performance, record it, and use it in any future production. And all the commercial rights sit with the producer in perpetuity, and I will never be paid again. And that's just one example of the kind of injustice that's been secured in those contracts. So we want South Africans to go to the SAGA website, read those clauses. I want them to get angry, and with that, to sign the petition.
Because, you know, at the end of the day, it is our actors. We see them on television every day, and it's saddening, you know, when you hear stories. Charlene Surti Richards, you know, one example of so many, who said that she had nothing basically to show for what she's done, not just as an actor, but for this country, the work that she's done, you know. It's a South African name, it's a South African product, it's proudly South African. And not to give somebody their due at the end of the day, I think is very sad for our South African actors especially. I think very lastly from your side, are there any negotiations happening right now to help alleviate this problem and also to get these clauses, you know, looked at?
There is no mechanism for that negotiation to happen, and that's our big concern. There isn't a forum where we can sit together with a broadcaster or a streamer or a producer to say, can we discuss this injustice? And that's part of the problem. If you have tied our hands behind our back so that we are not allowed to negotiate, and then you are now dangling us over the edge of a cliff by saying, we're not going to talk to you anyway. And make no mistake, we have approached some of the streamers already to say, we are concerned about the provisions you have in these actor contracts. And it wouldn't surprise you, Baron, to tell you quite openly, and even this we have put out on social media as well, that they have rejected attempts by SAGA to meet with them to discuss our concerns.
All right. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for this evening, but thank you so much for coming through here to the show on Newsnight on UNCA.
Thank you.
And hopefully something can be done, but that website, of course, SAGA website, you can go and do your little bit as a South African and sign that petition. But of course, read through those clauses, as you said,
absolutely,
that are very problematic. Thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you.
Of course, Dev Narayan, of course, the chairman of the SAGA Guild of Actors, or SA Guild of Actors SAGA. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.